Hey, Sam, are you there?
Here I am.
Or I should say, Professor Samantha Muka of the Stevens Institute of Technology. Um, I'm John Horgan. I'm a science writer, and I also am a professor at Stevens. And I'm recording these chats with some of my favorite colleagues at Stevens, just to let people out there in the world, prospective students especially, know who we are and what we do. So thanks for being here, Sam.
Thanks for having me, John.
All right. So I guess my first question is, explain. You are an historian of science who specializes in marine biology. Why? Why did you become that?
Yeah. So I started out as a historian of medicine, right? Which now I'm kind of kicking myself because I would be a little bit more useful at the moment. And then I fell into this as I got interested in eugenics. It's a really weird path. And a very prominent public eugenicist in New York City was the first female head of the first female secretary of the New York Aquarium. And so I ended up looking at her papers in the New York Aquarium, and I found this just like treasure trove of cool stuff. There's a long tradition, a long history of oceanography, right? You get on a boat, Darwin, we love it, all of these things. But surprisingly, there just wasn't a lot, especially on modern marine biology. So taking organisms, looking at them in tanks and kind of trying to figure out stuff like that. I stuck with the project for two reasons. One is that the people who work in the marine field today are just literally the best people to work with. Like if you show any interest in the work that they're doing, they could go for hours. They also work in primarily warm climates, which I'm always cold, so that might be an aside, but climate has a lot to do with why I chose it. But second, because the history hasn't been told, but it is rapidly becoming more important to kind of what's happening in the world. So even as we kind of pretend that environmental or climate issues are going away, as we kind of focus on other stuff, it's getting progressively worse out there in the marine environment. And there are a lot of people whose work is continuing as it has for a long time because they work in tanks and they try to figure out the ocean. And so it's extremely important, even if it's not always in the national spotlight. And so these two things, just a really vibrant community and a really important reason for the work to be done, are the reason that I keep looking at the history, right? Because it's just so cool.
Well, I've just got to say, pretty much every single conversation I've ever had with you, I always learn something that I didn't know. And it's usually something that makes me go, oh my God, have you written about that? But let me just ask you this, since you mentioned climate change, do you ever think of yourself or finding yourself thinking of yourself as an activist as well as a scholar? Do you want your work to have an impact on debates, for example, about how global warming is affecting oceans?
Yeah, I mean, so if anything, to a certain extent, gosh, I wish I wasn't, right? Like I wish that there wasn't that seed of activism, not because I have a problem speaking up, but because it would mean that everyone was kind of on the same page about just the basic premise, which is like climate change exists, right? And to tell you the truth, I think almost every community that I would think of that has a stake, but I say almost because there is kind of a touristy community that has a stake in the ocean. Almost every community that directly draws its kind of livelihood from the ocean, regardless of why that they think climate change happens, agrees that something pretty bad is happening, right? So in that sense, what my job is not necessarily to be an advocate for people believing in climate change, but I think more commonly, I think of myself as just like a louder, like not a louder voice, but a voice that can translate those concerns, regardless of what they are, to a wider audience, right? So to the aquarium community does so much fantastic work. The marine biology community does a lot of fantastic work. When I go into these spaces, they'll often say like, gosh, it's so tiring to try to figure out how to talk to people about this, right? Like I hate it. That's not why I went to graduate school, to be a scientist. It turns out that's why I went to graduate school, right? And so it really is quite helpful, not necessarily to think of myself as an advocate, but to think of myself as a like an ombudsman between scientists and their public, to kind of help the public and scientists understand each other a little bit better. And that sounds to me like a little bit of a better thing. I just take it as a fact that climate change exists and that it is bad for the ocean. And you're not going to talk to someone who is a fisherman or someone who is a scientist or someone who is, you know, an aquarist, and they're not going to deny that, right? Because they know they are close to those places. So in the marine community, it's just not deniable. So, but I mean, I do think of myself sometimes as an advocate for a certain type of aquarium and a certain type of kind of institutional advocate, because those spaces are very important and they're often overlooked, not just in the public community, and people love aquariums, but more importantly in the scientific community and in the conservation community. Like sometimes I think that they're overlooked. So oddly enough, I think if I am an advocate, it is towards another group in that community, not towards the public. Yeah.
So I'm curious how you get students to care about what you care about. For me, that's always a challenge in my classes. Not just to sort of convey information to students or give them enough knowledge so that they can give it back to me on exams and in papers, but actually to care about certain topics. I just wonder if there's anything that you do in your classes.
When I was an undergraduate, I think the classes that stuck with me the most were the ones that gave me the most choice, right? To not care about the things that the professor cared about, but to care about the things that I had carried into the classroom, right? And it's really interesting because I think about this a lot. I was just thinking about it today. The things that I wanted to study revolving around a certain topic were never the things that a professor wanted me to study, right? I ended up in the history that I did because I still was like, I still don't know anything about that, right? I would really like to know. And so there were certain professors. There's a guy, his name is Robinson Herrera at Florida State University, where I did my undergraduate, and he gave us these really open-ended projects that he would just say, like, choose something you're interested in and go within the confines of this course, study it, right? Like, do something fun, do something interesting. And so I actually try to translate a lot of what I remember from his assignments into my course. So for instance, I taught a course on underwater visualization in the spring, and gosh, I thought it wasn't going very well. I was like, man, this course is a real bummer. And part of that is, anyone who teaches environmental history or environmental subjects, it's a downer, right? And so you're like, and I don't always want to be like, you should care, right? Stop being so complacent, kids. And so, in the midterm, I let students choose any book that had the ocean as a character, as the main character, a fiction book, and then to write about it based on what we'd done in the class. This allows students to go in pretty much any direction that they want, right? So if you're reading Jaws and your classmate is reading Moby Dick, right? Those are two very different things, and they mean different things, and they have the choices that you're taking mean a lot about what you want to get out of the course, right? So then at the end of the course, I gave students, an assignment where they could do any type of visualization, any type of poetry or short story or art, And then they did an extended bibliography, annotated bibliography, to tell me how they had used, or thought through the historical sources that we used to create this, right? And so one student made a quilt, right, with a huge oil derrick on it, and all of these beautiful things, slash ugly things. And then, another student wrote a short story, and you can just see, right? So hopefully when those students leave that class, they're not necessarily interested in what I'm interested in, but they have a different they have fully internalized an interest that they have. And now they know, right, that there is a background to that belief or thought process, right? There are certain things that students become interested in only because they've never heard of them before, right? So when I teach history of medicine, it's like a whole new world, right? We just imagine that these things occur instead of having history. So I don't have to work very hard for that, right? It's just like mind blowing. They love that topic. But certain things, when you drill down into them, you have to let students just decide what they like. And some things they back into, right? Into loving. And so, those are the things that you can't force. And so I try to let students have the most creative potential to just find what interests them within that subject. They wouldn't sign up for the class if they didn't have a kernel of interest. And so I don't want to smother that with just like barking at them, which I'm fully capable of doing, by the way, because I can go on for hours. But
I know you are. That's inspiring, actually. I think I'm going to try to give my students more freedom. I love the idea of creating a quilt.
It was beautiful.
As a project.
Yeah, it was actually the saddest thing to me, because for the first time ever, I wasn't collecting material product at the end of the course. So I would have been like, oh, darn, I can't give that piece back to you, right? Because I want to but I mean, even to think about it, like students did poetry. One student built a whole microcosm in their backyard, like a big tank with all of these different things. Another student did, like an interview talk show where the Jaws shark was the talk show host, which was completely hilarious. I mean, comedy is very difficult, and they did such a good job. And another student did kind of a musical mashup of like YouTube taxonomy videos, and it was like fantastic. So, I mean, I think at Stevens, one of the more beautiful things to think about is that, and at all universities ever taught, if you give students the wherewithal to just do whatever they want, they will surprise you with how much effort they put in, because like it's just that's their interest, right? So it was a perfect thing. But even in lower level classes, right? So even when we do primary source analysis, I'll usually say go to this lump of sources and you choose whichever one you want. It's not up to me to give you. When I was an undergraduate in history, they would give you a primary source, and then they would teach you how to read it. Mm-hmm. And that's useful, but it's not always the thing that you want to be reading. And so, we as people who specialize in history, we get to read things we're interested in, right? And those are the things that make us excited about history. And so if I wasn't excited about marine biology, sitting through reading like log books of whaling ships for 18 hours, which I've done, it would make me not like history. So even in those early classes, like just giving students the choices of historical documents to read is just so much easier for them.
All right. I think I'll make this my last question, and this just occurs to me as we've been speaking. So we're going through a period when so we're recording this in June 2020. There are protests over racism, police killings of Black people in the United States. There, of course, is the ongoing pandemic. It's a period that I would say is characterized by challenges to conventional authorities and to experts. Now, you are a professor, so you are almost the embodiment of expertise. I wonder if everything that we're going through right now is making you reconsider your role as an expert, as a scholar, a teacher, an authority figure.
Oh man. It's really interesting because what's most interesting is when we talk about challenges to expertise, it depends on what type of expertise and what type of challenge you're looking at, right? So what's most interesting is I think that it doesn't necessarily scare historians to challenge expertise, because in a lot of ways, history is both praised as being something that everyone wants to use. Everyone wants to talk about a historical narrative as the reason that they're doing something. This is tradition. This is important because we understand history. I mean, the concept of kind of talking about the history of the United States is integral, both to kind of the public health issues that we're facing right now, right? Everyone wants to talk about the 1918 flu. Everyone wants to talk about those things. The truth is that, and everyone wants to talk about how important kind of statues and memory is to the way that we construct history. What they're not doing actually is going to historians, right? A lot. And so they'll say, well, this is the history, obviously. And what you find is just when students get into these classes and when they are taught this history, things are not about, listen to me, I'm telling you a story that is what you should believe, and this is the past. But it's about kind of thinking through not just how historians have changed over time, their thinking, but kind of how not static history has been in some sense, right?
So there's almost some subversion, anti-authoritarianism built into the...
I would think that, no, I mean, I would think the case is just very few historians get to be the type of expertise, which is just a monolith, right?
Yeah.
That's not our voice, right? We don't have to worry about always being an expert, because you know what? No one has listened to us, right? We're like screaming into a void. So do I think that my work matters more now? Yeah, I think it does, actually. I think being a historian at this moment in time is extremely important to like hold the line and like let people know that these people have been doing good work for a very long time. Like, this is not history we don't know. If you want to know about the 1918 flu, go to a historian of the 1918 flu. They exist. They're amazing. They know so much. Like, they know what people had for breakfast and where they went and face mask wearing and all of those things, right? And if you want to know about the Civil War or the impact of race, or just about like, Black labor or housing disputes or any of these things, go to a historian, right? They exist. But that's not what's happening right now, right? And so, everything looks like it's a battle against expertise, but the truth is it's a battle against a lot of people who truthfully aren't experts, right? And the expert historians are just sitting around kind of vibrating with anger on Twitter,